European allies pledged missiles and artillery for Ukraine as Kyiv urged partners to scale up support. The new promises flew in the face of a Kremlin warning against what it calls extremely dangerous escalation if the West sent longer-range weapons to Kyiv. The West has been long fearful of provoking direct confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia, as Ukraine ramped up calls for tanks and longer-range weapons ahead of a key meeting in Germany designed to discuss military aid to Ukraine. Britain announced it would send 600 Brimstone missiles to the war-torn country. Denmark said it would donate 19 French-made Caesar howitzers to Ukraine, and Sweden promised to send its Archer artillery system, a modern mobile howitzer requested by Kyiv for months. EU Chief Charles Michel said he believed that tanks must be delivered as he visited Kyiv. As the pledges came in, Ukraine said it was time to stop trembling and take the final step. Ukraine believes tanks are the key to end war properly. Western partners fear that Ukraine could use long-range weapons to hit deep inside Russian territory or Crimea, a peninsula Moscow annexed in 2014, despite Kyiv promising it would not do so. The Kremlin warned of escalating the conflict to a whole new level if the West meets Ukraine's latest calls for longer-range weapons. There are reports that Washington is considering softening its position and allowing Ukraine to use US-supplied weapons against Russian targets in Crimea. Meanwhile, a new front for Ukraine is opening up at the Belarus border. Social media and Ukrainian media are reporting that Russia is using railway tank cars to secretly transport troops to Belarus for a military buildup. Russia and Belarus began joint military exercises earlier this week, which have triggered fears in Kyiv and the West that Moscow could use its ally to launch a new ground offensive in Ukraine. Russia used its neighbor Belarus as a springboard for its invasion of Ukraine last February. The two allies are conducting Air Force drills using all Belarus military airfields and began joint army exercises. Minsk says that air drills are defensive and it will not enter the war, but it maintains that Ukraine has been provoking Belarus.
При любых контактах, которые у нас случаются с Западом и другими, мы говорим о том, что Россия никогда не была против мира. Пожалуйста, давайте будем договариваться, мы готовы в этом, Сергей Викторович, участвовать, вы в этом не должны сомневаться. Если что-то надо с нашей стороны, и мы можем сделать, вы хорошо знаете, что мы можем сделать, скажите прямо, мы будем работать вместе, рука об руку.
У нас здесь единая позиция о том, каких целей необходимо достигать и как нужно добиваться того, чтобы ни в отношении России, ни в отношении Беларуси от наших соседей, будь то Украина или кто-то еще, не исходили никакие угрозы.
Ukraine has continuously warned of possible attacks from Belarus, and President Volodymyr Zelensky said last week that the country must be ready at its border with Belarus. Belarus has conducted numerous military exercises since the invasion began, both on its own and jointly with Russia. Together with Moscow, Minsk has also been bolstering the drills with weaponry and military equipment. The Russia-Ukraine war, which is now in its 11th month, is intensifying as Ukrainian forces are training hard for the threat of a fresh assault across a new front in the north. Ukraine fears Russia could build up forces on Belarus territory before striking in the northwest. Ukrainian forces, including the armed forces, National Guard, and the security services, attended a joint military drill on Wednesday around western towns near the Belarusian border because of the threat of a fresh assault across a new front in the north. Ukraine feared Russia could build up forces in this territory of its ally, Belarus, before striking in the northwest. Meanwhile, Russia has yet again changed its commanders for the war that it calls Special Military Operation. In October, Belarus announced the formation of a joint regional force with Moscow, with several thousand Russian servicemen arriving in the ex-Soviet country, fueling concerns Minsk could send troops to Ukraine. Belarus is a close ally of Russia and allowed Putin to use its territory as one of the launch pads for his February 24th invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin has for years sought to deepen integration with Belarus, which relies on Moscow for cheap oil and loans. But Lukashenko, Belarus's president, had resisted outright unification with Russia despite being a key ally in the war. Putin had earlier visited Belarus in a trip that was seen as an attempt to pressure Lukashenko to send his troops to Ukraine alongside Russia's military after a series of defeats for Moscow. Ahead of Putin's visit, Ukraine's leader Zelensky had also described the situation on Ukraine's border with Russia and Belarus as a constant priority. Lukashenko, who has been in power since 1994, is a long-time Kremlin ally. Meanwhile, Ukraine forces are stretched to their limit in the Eastern Front, making this possible opening of a new front extremely problematic for it. The fate of Soledar in eastern Ukraine was uncertain after Russian group Wagner claimed it controlled the gateway town. But Kremlin cautioned against declaring victory prematurely. In his daily address on Wednesday, Zelensky insisted that the front was holding, although Ukraine admitted it had been the bloodiest battle so far, but said the fighting continued. Moscow, meanwhile, announced it had put Army Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov in charge of the Ukrainian conflict. Sergei Surovikin, the commander of Russia's forces in Ukraine for the past 3 months, will become Gerasimov's deputy, the defense ministry announced. Analysts say the competing statements around Soledar point to infighting among the Russian forces, which have been trying to capture the whole of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region since failing to take Kyiv last year. The Institute for Study of War, a US-based think tank, said in a publication it believed Gerasimov's appointment is likely intended to support an intended decisive Russian military effort in 2023, likely resumed Russian offensive operations. Both Moscow and Kyiv have said that the battle has been long and brutal. If Soledar did fall to Moscow's forces, it would be Russia's first significant territorial gain in Ukraine for months. The war-battered salt mining town in the eastern Donetsk region lies about 15 kilometers from Bakhmut, a larger urban hub that Russia has been trying to seize. One thing is for sure, Ukraine's battle in the east will suffer a huge setback if this new front with Belarus is opened up.